Welcome to our first live feedback in this iTunes U course. We're going to take a look at 3 examples of the personal educational narrative, and what I have to show you today are 3 real student examples of this essay. These are essays written by some of my former students who have given me permission to make use of them in this course. Obviously, I've taken out their names, so you won't be able to identify them. But I'm going to show you 3 different examples, and they range in pretty good essay all the way down to one that really struggles. All of these will be available in PDF format with my changes and comments embedded in there, so you can download those documents and take a look at them. So I won't go through every single detail on these essays, but I want to give you a sense of where these essays fall on the grading scale and what I'm specifically looking for in this essay. So the way I'm going to do this is through Microsoft Word's track changes. So everything you see in red, that is my writing. That is my commenting on this student's essay. So let's start off with this first one. Again, this is the personal narrative essay. And this one struggled a little bit. And the reason why I included it in here as an example is that it is a pretty good example of what not to do and how to not format a narrative. So if you take a look at this essay, it struggles on a couple different levels. One is basic sentence structure and word choice, and you'll see that I corrected a lot of the word choice issues and some of the sentence issues. Anything that's highlighted in red is something that I thought needs some clarification. You'll notice that a lot of verb tenses are incorrect and or missing. A few spelling issues as well. But on a bigger scale, this essay is really lacking any central conflict. So by the time we get down to the end of the introduction in this first paragraph, you should be able to see a conflict. And it isn't really clear here. My best guess is that a conflict could be this issue of education being a long road, being a long journey back. This student took a lot of time off of school and is returning back to the classroom. But again, conflict isn't clear. There is no real clear thesis statement or much of a strong introduction. As we move further down, we see again some issues with word choice and dropping off words until we get to this idea here, which I've highlighted in yellow. And I thought this was really interesting and potentially a start of a narrative. So this student writes, "I've cleaned all the stones out of my path. There is nothing to slow me down." So my sense is that there is a potential conflict here with being held back, meeting a lot of obstacles, and coming into education for the first time in a long time. The problem with this essay is that it never actually builds that narrative. What we should expect to see is a story where this idea of being slowed down or clearing out a path or meeting resistance is demonstrated. So as we move on into the second page, we have this paragraph here, and aside from some of the smaller word choice issues, this paragraph is very descriptive. The problem is that it never actually becomes a narrative. And what we see towards the end of this paragraph is a danger that a lot of students fall into, and that's merely answering the prompts in the assignment write-up. So again, in the assignment write-up, those prompts, those questions that I've included in there, they are not meant for you to answer one by one. They're really meant to get your ideas out and flowing. Use them as part of your pre-writing process. So a couple recommendations here for this student. She obviously needs to proofread and make sure she works specifically on verb tenses and word choice. My sense from this student was that there was no outline. If you take the time to download the PDF and read this essay more closely, you'll get a sense that it's a little all over the place. There isn't much of an outline, much of a structure. And the student would clearly benefit from getting feedback from someone else, specifically in relation to conflict and narrative. So if we take a look at here are the 5 elements that I'm looking for in this essay as far as a grade is concerned. So for purpose and direction, I think this essay struggled a little bit. It wasn't clear where the essay was going. It lacked an overall structure. The thesis and introduction was almost non-existent. There was a little bit of an introduction, but again, the thesis was not clear. This student had some interesting examples, but they never supported a larger narrative. And conflict was really missing from this narrative. It was more a running essay about her general experiences. There was nothing central. There was no central conflict. And again, if you don't have conflict, you probably don't have a narrative. A number of mechanical errors. She did meet the 2 pages, but a number of mechanical errors, a number of spelling mistakes, verb mistakes, sentence level issues that need to be worked on. So for this student, I would score it a 28 out of 50, which, if you do the math, isn't quite passing. So this student struggled with this essay, and this essay came out a little bit on the rough side. So I included as something to take a look at. I will include the PDF for you to download. Let's move on to another essay. Same exact prompt. This is the personal narrative, but here's the second sample. And this one's a little bit better. This one gets a little closer to a central conflict. So if you're reading the introduction here, this student writes a very interesting line here towards the end. I'm really not that far from home. He's talking about moving to college. He went to a local school, only about an hour and a half away, but it feels like I'm on the other side of the United States. So there is this really interesting idea of isolation or being out on your own. What I expect to read in the rest of this narrative is more about that conflict, more about that conflict of isolation. So we'll see if that plays out here in the rest of the essay. So this student goes on and in the second paragraph really starts to hint at different conflicts, never really focuses on one specific conflict. I see a lot of potential conflicts in this second paragraph. And again, here is a very interesting line that could be the central focus of this narrative, being the first in your family to go to college and not having a support system. Again, that could be in itself a conflict. And if this student wanted to work on that conflict, he could have written a story that showed off that conflict dramatically and how it impacted him when he went to college. As we move on, again in this third paragraph, this student does the exact same thing as the first student, where he starts answering the prompts in the write-up. And again, that's not what those prompts are for. A number of spelling mistakes in here as well, kind of minor things. And then this story ends on another really interesting note, or this essay ends on another really interesting note. He starts talking about his first memory of a math class at the college level. And he goes on a little bit to explore this idea of feeling isolated. He was unprepared for the class. He felt like he didn't belong. I think this was probably the most interesting part of the narrative, because I think that could have been the heart of the narrative. So I would encourage this student to rewrite it and follow that central narrative as an example of the conflict of being in isolation or unprepared. So this student was getting there towards the end. So let's take a look at the grading. Purpose and direction, it was going in the right direction. I think it struggled with focus a little bit. The introduction and thesis was there, a very compelling idea of being in isolation, feeling like he is across the United States. A little weak on the examples and a little weak on this idea of conflict. There were many potential conflicts in this essay, nothing that was really central. A number of spelling issues and mechanical mistakes. So I'll take some points off there. So the total score for this essay is 34 out of 50. That comes in around the C range if you do the math. So this is very clearly a C level essay, and really right on the border. C, high D for this essay. So again, I will include this in the PDF as a PDF in the materials section. Last one for this assignment, and this one is a little bit better than the first two that we looked at. This essay avoided a lot of the spelling mistakes, a lot of the word choice issues, and was very clear from the beginning what was going on. So in this introduction, a very compelling introduction, a couple different hints on potential conflict. This student speaks a different language, and English was her second language, and that can be a huge conflict, and she hints at that early on. A couple things in this essay that I want to point out to you. It's really important to get rid of vague and meaningless phrases, and here is a good example. There are best parts and there are worst parts of school and education. That phrase came out of the assignment write-up, and it doesn't really mean anything in this introduction. So in those situations, I would say cut anything that is vague or meaningless. Here's another one. I see this word all the time, nowadays. I would encourage you never to use that word. It's oftentimes used incorrectly, and it's void of any meaning. So the introduction's okay in this essay. Here we get down to her thesis statement, and this is what I perceive to be the main conflict coming up in the narrative, and that is the road to education is difficult, but you have to take it one step at a time. So I expect to hear about the difficulties that this student faces and how that has changed her view of herself or education. She first touches on this issue of English as a second language and it being difficult. So that's a good example of a difficulty in her educational journey. She then talks about a really interesting idea of the pressure that she felt from her parents. And the rest of this paragraph talks about that pressure. These are great examples, but at this point, we're still lacking a central conflict in the story. This idea of pressure, I think, can be really interesting, and maybe that is the central conflict. But what we're missing is a focused narrative around that conflict. She moves on towards the bottom of this page and talks more about this pressure, about her pressure in writing, her pressure in education in general, and it being a difficult subject. Again, she's really tiptoeing around the narrative here. So if you think of her conflict as pressure, the issue of learning English as a second language, that could be a perfect narrative, or the issue of her parents wanting her to follow a specific career path, that could be a perfect narrative based on that conflict. Again, this student does the exact same thing that the first two students did, and that is really answering prompts that are in the assignment write-up. Again, those prompts are meant to get you thinking, are meant to be part of your pre-writing process, not necessarily to be answered one by one. And this essay gets pretty close to meeting the requirements for this assignment. So let's take a look at how I would grade this essay. And this essay did a little bit better. I think the purpose and direction was there. I think she was right on. The thesis and introduction was pretty clear. My concern was that she didn't necessarily follow up on that issue of difficulties down the road, and she had a lot of supporting examples, but again, they were not necessarily centered around a specific conflict. So I'm concerned about the lack of conflict. A few mechanical issues, nothing major. So I would score this essay 40 out of 50. That's in the B range, and I think this student was just about there. With a few minor revisions, this student could take her central conflict, which I believe to be pressure or difficulties, and weave a narrative around that, either English as a second language or picking out a different career than her parents wanted her, and use that narrative to show the difference between her former self and her current self, or her former perception of education and her current perception of education. So again, I'll include this document as a PDF in the materials tab. Take a look at these three examples. You see the range, and one essay struggled pretty heavily. Another one was middle of the road, and this one was a little bit better. Take a look at these three examples, and as you work towards your own personal narrative, make use of these examples as things that you can do and things that you should try to avoid as well. Also, make use of how I scored these as examples to your own self-assessment.